In this next block, we have 3 full talks coming at you. The first one is from Kristen Yu. And she is, gosh, I'm so jealous of these life choices. She is a PhD student in computer science at the University of Alberta, doing research around quests and video games. And she is here to share some of that research with us today. Kristen, are you ready?
Yeah, I am. Thanks so much for introducing me. As you mentioned, I'm Kristen Yu, and I'm presenting video game quest theory for improved PCG. Really quick about me, I am a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and I'm also a part-time game designer at Improbable. I design quests and narratives, and the focus of my PhD and a lot of things that I work on is quests. A quick overview for this talk. I want to talk to you guys about general quest theory, and I want to talk about 2 things specifically. The first is the concept of this general quest definition. So this is something that I've been working on, and it's a combination of academic work as well as my own personal experiences of actually being in a real life development environment. And then I also want to introduce to you guys the definition context purpose paradigm. So this is actually something that I learned from developers. I was lucky enough to be able to talk to a few of them, and I kind of distilled all of their wisdom and knowledge into this new paradigm. And I'd like to contextualize these new pieces of theory with some practical development lessons from actually working at Improbable. This kind of all started with the question, what is a quest? I wanted to know, and so I went and I asked a bunch of my coworkers at Improbable, and they all told me different things. And I also asked this to the lead world designer, and he said that he'd actually never been asked this question before, and he's been in the industry for over 15 years. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of thing where, maybe developers have a really good intuition for what a quest is, but they couldn't necessarily always tell you what it was. I then went and looked at academics and seeing what were they saying a quest is, and it was the same kind of story where they were all kind of saying different things depending on what school you were at and who your old professors were, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of led me to the idea of creating a general technical quest definition. A general quest definition should be able to provide us a couple of things. It should hopefully be able to help establish a common language when talking about quests. This can help reduce confusion when you're talking to somebody else about quests, because sometimes you're talking about the same thing, but you're using different words. So it can be a little bit tricky to navigate that thing until you guys get onto the same page. And it should also be applicable across games and genres. So the intent here is that you don't want to actually have a quest definition for every single game. There's a lot of games that already exist. There is many more that will exist. So that's just like honestly a lot of different definitions, and trying to go through, evaluate, and think critically about every single one of those is kind of a lot. And so to make it easier for myself, or maybe harder, I didn't want this definition to actually have to be tied to every single game. A technical quest definition also gives us a couple of things. The first is that it lends itself to technical applications of quests, such as procedural content generation. It also allows us to have more precise discussion when we're actually talking about quests. So this is basically the concept that you can more precisely talk about things really specifically when you have a agreed upon technical definition, rather than having to talk about things in more fuzzy, like English language kinds of things. So to actually develop this definition, I went and I read 16 different papers, and they were actually focused on procedurally generating quests, and they had 16 different definitions of a quest. So I synthesized all of the common elements, and then I also added in some practical developer experience that I got from working at Improbable, and that created this thing here at the bottom. This is the full technical version. I'm not actually going to be covering the math in this talk, so if you're interested, I will post a link in one of the social spaces, but this monstrosity is kind of what came out of that. What I'd like to do now, though, is actually walk you through the quest definition. So a quest is a set of tasks the player must complete in order to get one or more rewards. I also want to more fully define what I mean by reward, because reward is similarly one of those words that is a little bit fuzzy depending on who you ask. So under this definition, a reward is in-game items. So those are your standard currencies or other kinds of items that players might pick up. There are also narrative elements such as dialogue that an NPC says, or a cutscene that might play after the player completes the quest. And they can also be progression elements, and those are your standard kind of XP points, skill tree points, as well as also unlocking the next area of a map. The next thing I want to do is actually more formally define what a task is. So the task is going to be made up of several things. The first is that the players that can actually complete that particular task, and that's to account for multiplayer games. The second part is the objective that the player has to do. The third is going to be the system that actually monitors the game of whether the players actually completed that task or not. And this is something that's actually often ignored by academics, but everyone who's ever developed a game knows that this is really critically important. The next part is actually going to be the presentation of a task, and that's everything that you show to the player to help them understand like what they're supposed to do to actually complete the task. And this is something else that's also really often ignored by academics, even though it's really crucial to be able to actually, get that extra step of understanding from the player so that they can actually complete the particular task you put in front of them. And the last is going to be the rewards for the task, and I include the rewards of the task at the task level as well as at the quest level so that you can include for an idea of a reward schedule so the player might be getting small little things as they're completing each task in your quest. I'd like to walk through now an example with Animal Crossing New Horizons. I'd like to talk about the Nook Mile system, and I'd also like to specifically talk about the fishing quest, Angling for Perfection. This is the Catch a Lot of Fish quest. There's 5 things you need to do. The first is to catch 10 fish, catch 100 fish, catch 500 fish, catch 1,000 fish, and catch 3,000 fish. When you get to do that, the rewards are going to be the Nook Miles tickets, which is the premium in-game currency, as well as these passport titles, which allow for the player an extra level of self-expression. Now we need to actually apply this quest definition to this quest. The first thing you need to do is define your set of tasks, and that's just basically like the simple, straightforward way of actually chunking the thing that the player needs to do. And those are already very easily chunked for us in the different things that I listed out earlier. The next thing you want to do is say, like, these are all the rewards that you can get. These are all the different kinds of Nook Miles tickets, as well as the different titles you can get. The next thing we need to do is actually define each of the tasks that we identified earlier. There's actually a lot of commonality between all the tasks, so I'm just going to kind of like walk through all of them generally. The first part is the player, and that's just going to be the single player of the game because Animal Crossing is mostly single player. The objective is catch X number of fish, so for the first task, it's catch 10 fish. The monitoring system is just the system that checks whether the player has caught fish. And then the presentation is actually fully included in this stamp card here. And so there's a couple of different presentation elements that are important, but I'm just going to point at a couple of them. So the first one might be that there are stamps that shows the player how many tasks they've already completed in the test, as well as this little bubble in the middle that shows the player how far along they are in completing their current task. And the last part's the reward. So this is actually going to be different between each of the tasks because each of them get a different amount of reward for the player actually completing them. So left to right, they're just going to be shown across the bottom here. Now I'd like to talk through a couple of production benefits we got from actually using this quest definition in practice at Improbable. The first is that we're all on the same page with terminology. So not only did we onboard the entire quest design team, but I actually onboarded our programming team. And that's been really useful so that if design says the task is going to be this, then the programming knows exactly what they're talking about. And it also allowed us to consider all of the parts of a quest for systems design. So this is important for like programmers when they say, okay, I need to somehow create something that will do what this design is supposed to do. And so one of the things we were able to do is actually put together a list of all of the kinds of objectives that we wanted to be quests in the game. And we gave that to programming and said, this is everything we wanted to be able to do. Like even like our long shot, like far reach goals, this is what we want to be able to have our quest system handle. So they can look at that list and say, yes, I will build you something that can do all of that ahead of time. Instead of having some cases where designers might come back and say, oh, maybe what if we did this? And that might accidentally break the system you already have built. I'd also like to tell you a quick developer story. So in our game, we have things that are explicitly called quests, and that's actually like labeled as quests in the development environment. And we also have these things that are quest-like objects. So they look like quests, but we don't specifically call them quests in our game. However, using this general definition, the quest-like objects can actually just be considered quests. And what we were able to do then was actually use the quest system that we'd already built to actually provide the quest-like objects content to the player. So this obviously saves a lot of time because now you don't have to build up an entire another system to actually provide that content to the player, rather than what you might have done if you weren't necessarily thinking about this critically, where you just naively build another system to provide the quest-like content system. So this gives us our general quest definition, but to me, it always kind of felt like only a piece of the puzzle. Specifically at work, I was having problems actually fully discussing like everything about a quest, and the most obvious place was actually the design of a quest. So what I did is I went and I talked to developers. I talked to 15 different developers around the industry. And from that, I have over 13 hours of recording of them talking to me about Quest. And this is something that's actually really unique among the academic community. So normally academics are not necessarily going out and talking to developers and interviewing them to try and gain their knowledge. They're rather doing literature reviews of like, what are other academics saying? So this is interesting work for even academics. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the kinds of developers that I was able to interview. The first thing I did is I asked them what kind of studio they worked at. So 6 says that they were indie developers, 7 said they were not, and 2 said they experienced at both. I also asked them what kind of roles they actually play inside of their studio. And a majority of the developers I interviewed are Quest and narrative designers, but there's also going to be some people who have experience from systems and programming. The last thing I asked them was how many years of experience they have in the industry. So the minimum number of years that were reported was 3 and the maximum was 30. We then conducted thematic analysis on all of the interviews, and that's basically just adding a tag where everything is going to be under the same kind of idea or concept. So using this, we were able to generate 21 different tags that can be roughly grouped into 6 categories. So it's critical thinking, presentation, player experience, technical details, goals, and rewards. So this slide represents the full space of everything that the developers I talked to wanted to talk to me about quests. What I was able to do was take all of that information that they told me and kind of like organize it into this new paradigm, the definition, context, purpose paradigm. This paradigm starts with the definition, which defines the state space of all possible quests in games. Then there's the context. So that's going to be the set of creative or production constraints the developers actually place on the quest. And the last part is the purpose, which is the reason or reasons that the quest is in the game. As you can kind of see from the picture, the context and the purpose act as a funnel where they take the state space of all possible quests and they narrow it into the set of quests that are actually usable for a particular game. Though it's not shown in the picture for clarity, a game can have multiple contexts and multiple purposes, and they can overlap as needed in order to more fully explain the design. I'd like to walk through another example using this paradigm, and I'd like to use Animal Crossing New Horizons again. I want to talk about their regular Nook Miles quests as well as the Nook Miles Plus quests. So for definition, I'm just going to use the general quest definition that I talked about earlier in the talk. Now we need to talk about context. There's 2 contexts for Animal Crossing. One is the Nook Miles, and the other is the Nook Miles Plus context. For the Nook Miles context, we have this stamp card appearance in the game. Each of these quests is going to have 1, 3, or 5 amounts of tasks, and each of these tasks are going to take varying lengths of time. They're also going to be rewarding the player with usually large amounts of reward. And then this content is going to be exhausted by the player, so that means that once they've completed it, they can't do it again. By contrast, we have the Nook Miles Plus context. So it has this bubble appearance in the game and it always has 1 task. These tasks should be easy to complete, as well as they will give the player a small amount of reward for completing those tasks. This content is shown to the player as the 5 circles, as you see here on the screen. And when the player actually completes one of those quests, the new one will come into its place. So this content is functionally infinite. Now I'd like to talk about the purpose, and I'd actually like to take a step back and talk about the purpose of quests in Animal Crossing in general, and that's to provide the player with in-game goals to achieve. When you have a game like Animal Crossing, when there is a high amount of player agency, they can sometimes feel lost and don't really know what to do. So this allows the player to have some directed goals that get them to interact with systems until they can self-regulate and say, like, oh, okay, actually I really want to do this because I did a quest that was using this system earlier. For the regular Nook Miles purpose, it's to provide the player with more challenging content, as well as reward that player with a proportionally high reward for actually completing that content. And the Nook Miles Plus purpose is to have small, easy challenges for the player to complete on a daily basis and reward the player with small amounts of reward. The purposes for the regular Nook Miles and the Nook Miles Plus are complementary to each other and provide a satisfying pacing experience where you have large amounts of rewards from the regular Nook Miles system interspersed with small rewards from the Nook Miles Plus. Now I'd like to talk about a couple of applications for the definition context purpose paradigm. However, I would love to talk to anybody if they have any other ideas of how to actually apply this paradigm. The first is to compare and contrast like we did with the Animal Crossing example. The next is to actually do procedural content generation for quests, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit more in the following example, as well as to actually evaluate quests in the appropriate design space, which I'm also going to cover in the next example. I'm going to do a PCG example now because we are at Roguelike Celebration. And let's just say we're going to create a quest generator, and this generator is going to narratively link quests together to tell a secondary story in the game. Using this paradigm, we can define the context and we can specify things like the kind of tasks that will be generated, the types of rewards that will be given by this quest generator, the presentation of the quest generator. You don't have to do this, but sometimes you might want to differentiate between handcrafted content and content that is generated, as well as set developer expectations. So when you have a quest generator, you need to be able to communicate effectively to other developers that might be using this generator. And as I already mentioned, a lot of people have their own biases and ideas about what a quest is. So if you specifically lay out, this is the context and this is the purpose of these quests, they're going to come out of it, they're going to have appropriate expectations and maybe not be disappointed because they had their own biases about what a quest is. Now we're going to actually try and build out an entire game. So we're going to fill out our content with a bunch of fest quests because they're easy to write and we can write those in like an hour. And then we're also going to create a bunch of handcrafted main quest things so we can have this really nice narrative for the player to engage with. The question then becomes, what kind of content do I actually have in my game? And usually we would think of the side and main kind of thing that we've been using for a really long time. So obviously we want to assign the side quest to a bunch of fetch quests. And obviously the main quest story is going to be our main quest. But we have this quest generator. We might want to say it's side quests because they're not our handcrafted main quests. But it also kind of feels weird to call them side quests because they have like high amount of narrative in it because they're telling secondary stories. Now instead, we can use the definition context purpose paradigm to more fully classify the different types of content. We can use the definition to be the same across all three of the different contents. For context for the first two, we can say that those quests have exactly one task, and by contrast, the main story has multiple tasks. The purpose for a bunch of fetch quests is going to be to encourage the player to explore around because they have to run around the map in order to actually complete those quests. And the purpose for the other kinds of content we have is to tell the player a story. So using this, we can more fully define like the kinds of content we're going to have in our game. And it's more flexible than the old way of saying side and main quests because you're able to have as many kinds of silos or kinds of content you have more explicitly defined. Now I'd like to talk about a couple of production benefits. The first is that it clearly defines our types of content, like I just explained with the previous example. The second, that it allows us to evaluate our content based on whether they're fulfilling their purpose. And so this comes back from the third application that I gave you guys, which was actually to evaluate content based on their design space. So the idea here is that we can actually take a piece of quest content and say, is this content actually fulfilling its purpose? If it's not, we either tweak it, get rid of it, or move it to a different content bucket because it's just not working. And then the last part is actually to give design production constraints. So the context can not only be used to say things like, oh, well, this kind of only has two casts, but it can also be actual really practical design or production things such as don't make a cutscene. I know cutscenes are really expensive, so you don't want design to be getting too ahead of themselves and designing a bunch of cutscenes. So you can add those kinds of things to your content or to your context so that design doesn't sometimes get a little bit carried away when they're creating content. I know personally, I appreciate these kinds of constraints because constraint breed creativity. I'd like to now tell you guys another quick developer story. In our game, we have multiplayer quests and we also have single player quests. And because of the culture at our studio, anybody can actually come up and suggest ideas for quests. So somebody came to our quest team and said, I have an idea for a multiplayer quest, and they told us it. And when we actually thought about it, it's actually a single player quest idea. And we know this because we fully defined the kinds of content we have in our game with both the context and purpose for the multiplayer quest as well as the context and purpose for the single player quest. So we can take this new idea and say, does this match the purpose for multiplayer or does this match the purpose for single player? And it better match the purpose for single player. So that's how we decided this new piece of content would be part of the single player quest. So in conclusion, I wanted to talk to you guys about this general quest definition that I have been working on, which is a combination of academic work as well as practical development experience. And then I also wanted to introduce to you guys the definition context purpose paradigm, which is something that I got from other developers. I just organized their thoughts and ideas into a way that made sense. I did not necessarily come up with these things myself, but I look forward to your questions. And if you need something, you can email me.
All right. Thanks so much for that. That was, you blew a lot of minds just now. Chat was super excited about everything you had to say. Lots of screenshotting every slide. We were collectively surprised that the definition involved so much math, but surprised and excited.
I think that the math is not as scary as it looks, but I know that it can take a little bit to digest. So,
the fact that there's math without numbers always gives me hesitation. Right. So we've got some time for questions. I'm going to start because I've got the microphone. In doing your research, was there anything in all of this, talking with developers that surprised you?
So specifically with the developer interviews, I was honestly surprised at the amount of variation of like the things that they wanted to tell me about quests. I know not everyone I talked to was like specifically a quest or narrative designer, but like even among like the designers, there wasn't really like a consensus of like, yeah, this is a quest. It's kind of like you have like there's an elephant in the room and then everyone's staring at like a different part of the elephant. So like all these developers are talking about the same thing, but they're telling me different parts of it. So that's kind of how I was able to like cobble together this paradigm of like, oh, well, this person was talking about this part and this person's this part. So yeah.
Right on. So looking at our note wall, can people find the paper with more details somewhere yet?
Yes, there are free copies of all the papers that this is. I will post the link in the social space after I'm done here.
Fabulous. Some clarification on what is the difference between a quest-like object and a quest proper?
So I kind of just did that to be pedantic. It kind of like ruins the story if you know it's a quest beforehand, right? Essentially the difference within like the actual company was like these things were called quests and were like development quests, but like these other things were not called quests basically. And I think one of the things that is a little bit surprising about my definition, and I think might be a little bit radical to some people, is like I actually would consider like a level to be a quest. So like Mario 1-1 is a quest, which is kind of weird to think about, but if you apply the definition, it works out. Like it has everything you need in it. So I think that it's just the matter of like saying it's not necessarily useful to call levels quests in a game. It's more useful for like practical development purposes to call it a level. And so for us, it was more useful to call it something else, but it happened to be advantageous for us to actually just use the quest system we already had.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Cool. Let's see what else we got. How have you found that differences among games and monitoring systems affect either the theorist or the practitioner? Why not leave it out of the framework for simplicity?
I think that honestly being able to evaluate quests independent of games is really important because quests are not just like relegated to RPGs anymore, right? You know, quests are showing up in all sorts of places, especially with season passes being really popular. Every single season pass is a quest, right? They have little quests in them, right? So I think that like being able to strip down like games and genres, because genre is fuzzy and you never know what genres games really are. They're kind of like loosely labeled things. I guess with regards to the monitoring system, I wanted to include it because there's a really practical, technical implementation details of quests. Like they need code to run it and monitor it and do all these other things. And it's one of those things where, from an academic perspective, it could be useful to know whether a quest is finished or not, so then you could generate the next step or something like that. Or you want to know like which path they took down your branching narrative. So having the ability to technically include that and to have it be there for the technical application where it's useful. Whereas, you know, if it's not useful for you, if you're designing a quest, like drop it, ignore it. That's fine. Like I'm not going to be offended if you don't use every single little part of the quest definition.
Excellent. Okay, that covers the note wall. Someone wants to know if you're going to put your slides up.
I can put my slides up if that would be useful to everybody.
We would love that.
Yeah, sure, you can do that.
Drop a link in the space hanger.
Yeah, I can do that.
And if you tweet it, we'll retweet it. I don't remember if you have a Twitter.
I don't have a Twitter.
But if you
I'm like the only game dev that
send
doesn't have
us
a Twitter.
the link, I can retweet it.
Okay, that would be great.
Somebody gave me the keys to the Twitter account this year. All right. Cool. Any parting thoughts?
I don't know. Honestly, I'm really excited to hear from you guys any feedback that you have for me. The definition, context, purpose paradigm was not run past any developers until now. So like this is literally like my coworkers have the sneak peek, but like this is the largest, I guess audience that is not academic. And I think like what the development community thinks of it is really, really important. So if you have any thoughts on like any kinds of applications, what might be interesting to do with it, or maybe if you find it doesn't quite make sense in some ways, like I would love to talk about it.
Great. And if you're going to stick around, we will be having you in the breakout room Mage at 5 o'clock Pacific. So if y'all have thoughts that you want to share or just more questions you want to ask, that is the time and place to do it. Cool. Kristen, thank you so much. This has been, like I said, you blew all our minds.